This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Ruth Wisse. Ruth Wisse is a Harvard professor emeritus, now living in New York City. She is the Martin Peretz Professor Emeritus of Yiddish Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard. She's written books. For example, If I'm Not For Myself, The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews, that's 1992. The Modern Jewish Canon, A Journey Through Language and Culture, 2000. And Jews and Power, 2008. And her funny book, her book on Jewish jokes, which is titled No Joke, Making Jewish Humor, in 2013, most recently. She's a member of the editorial board of the Jewish Review of Books, and she contributes frequently to the magazine commentary and writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she got a prize from President of the United States, the National Humanities Medal.
Sorry.
And now she's going to talk on anti-Semitism and why it matters. Ruth Wisse.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, this is a tremendous privilege to be on this side of the table, because I would say that my happiest experience at Harvard in the 21 years I taught here was sitting where you're sitting now. I loved the program in constitutional government. I'm so grateful to Harvey for having created it and made it possible for people like myself to find a home here. My field is Yiddish literature, not political studies. I am woefully undereducated in political theory and political thought. But I say this with no apology, really, because I come here, in a sense, a little bit aggressively to the fields of political theory and political thought. Anti-Semitism became a subject of mine, largely because no one else that I could see was at all interested in it in the way that I was, and in the way that I thought it should be tackled, which is to say, politically. And so my main purpose in being here, whatever else is said, is to really plead with you, some of you individually who can do this, and some of you just as a pressure group, to see why anti-Semitism is so under-examined. And so I will just get into this, but the analogy that often occurs to me, because anti-Semitism I have written out here as A-S, it's so close to AIDS, to AIDS, that the analogy is alive for me. And if you think of what happened when AIDS was noticed as a real threat to individuals and to the collective, then you see how people went about handling it. They took it very seriously, and they did not raise a museum to AIDS. They did not study the history of AIDS. They did not only take, demographic studies of AIDS, but one of the things that they did is they went about it with what we call scientific detachment to isolate the variables that created this disease in order to find a way of limiting it or of trying to cure it. Nothing like that, if you notice, has been done in anti-Semitism. And in fact, the end of my paper is really what points to that. The only program, as far as I know, in the United States at a university that was doing this kind of thing was the program at Yale, the study of anti-Semitism. It had one conference that was really on point, a large-scale 3-day conference which came closest to what I'm getting to here, really that kind of analysis. And guess what? The person who was running it and all of us who were really more or less insiders on this, we knew that this was going to be, if this conference was really successful, the program would be closed down. And that is exactly what happened. The conference was a success at trying to analyze what is anti-Semitism, how does it function, what is it doing today, and because it was so successful, the representative who had come from the provost's office was obviously very troubled. The Palestinian factions, the certain factions on campus that don't like this subject and don't like it being treated in a certain way, brought it to the attention of the administration. The administration didn't want this kind of controversy, and the program was closed. And what it substituted for it, it put it in the hands of a professor of French literature, happens to be a very nice person, I'm sure. And the only conference that they're having this year on the subject is anti-Semitism on the right. Completely a diversionary subject as far as I'm concerned. So that is where people sort of seem to be comfortable with it. But in fact, that whole analytic study of the subject that was the idea of this program that was there at Yale, sort of under the radar for a number of years, was then closed down. So this is the context within which I'm trying to address the subject. So I thank you so much for coming here, and I would really thank you for anything critical that you might have to say about the paper or about my treatment of it, because this is by no means an attempt to be definitive on the subject, but just to say the way in which it should be approached. So what are some of the problems of the approach itself? So when you say to people anti-Semitism, you're going to be speaking about anti-Semitism at Harvard. Almost anybody would say, oh, yeah, you know, Harvard has a record of anti-Semitism. Did you know in the 30s it had a quota on Jews who came in? Yeah, okay. I'm not troubled by that, may I say. Yeah, it's horrible to have had a quota. But you know that it had an even stricter quota on African Americans? And what about Catholics? If you read the story of Catholics at that time. In other words, yes, there was discrimination at hotels, there was social discrimination in the American fabric and all the rest of it. Was it anti-Semitism in the way that I'm going to try to define it? No, it was discrimination, which is awful enough. Bias, prejudice, all these things fit into the subject. But this is not the political use of it. So that is one thing. Then my great teacher, one of my great teachers, I've been fortunate, was one of the world's leading historians of Jewish historians. No one will have that scope again, Sailor Baron, who taught for many years at Columbia. He defined it as anti-Semitism is the dislike of the unlike. Very neat. But what does that mean? I mean, all kinds of prejudice are the dislike of the unlike. So you see, yes, it's true, but it's a generic thing. And so it fits into that category, but it's not unique in that particular way. And just two more. Thomas Sowell, who is one of our great thinkers, wrote, is anti-Semitism generic? And so he shows something very interesting. He takes it to be the middleman function of the Jews. And he shows how middlemen minorities are discriminated against. And yes, the Jews are discriminated against because they are a middleman minority. But if you look at the Koreans in that situation, and you look at East Asians in this situation, they too are middlemen minorities. Violence is sometimes directed against them. Therefore, Jews fit into that category. So there's really nothing unique about it in that way, because if you look at middlemen minorities, this is a way of subsuming anti-Semitism under that category. Again, partially true. This is true, but it is not sufficient. And this is what I mean by looking at the variables of the situation. And then even Hitlerism, racial prejudice. So when you say, yes, of course, that's the paradigm of what people think is the paradigm of anti-Semitism, they immediately think of Hitlerism and so on. Well, but, you know, because of the racial policies of Germany, it was also directed against the extinction of Gypsies. Now, Gypsies are not Jews. So if you're looking at the racial component, even in Aryanism, you see, again, it's a function of it, but it is not anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism cannot be collapsed in that category of racial. And I'll just go one more quotation of this kind. Anthony Julius, some of you may know of, he's a great barrister in England, but in the way that the Brits managed to do it, he is a polymath and he writes on all subjects. And one of the books that he wrote, a huge book actually, is The History of Anti-Semitism in England. And so at the very beginning of his book, he tries to define it in some way. So here's what he says. It's perhaps a repertoire of attitudes, myths, and defamations in circulation at any given time. It is a kind of discursive swamp, a resource on which religious and political movements, writers and artists, demagogues, and the variously disaffected all draw without ever draining. It is not a political philosophy or anything close to one. It is not a conception of the world. It is merely an idée fixe, a hatred dressed up as a conviction, a protean, unstable combination of received ideas compounded by malice. Now, my argument is exactly the opposite. It is not a discursive swamp, in my opinion. It is a political phenomenon. And it's in that category that I would like to look at it. It's very hard to define it specifically. It can be a political philosophy, a political ideology, a political movement, a political function, political strategy. But the reason it succeeds as it does and is now, I think, much more universally potent than it ever was is because of its political function. So this is really what I have tried to lay out here. So what do I mean by that? My definition of it would be that anti-Semitism is the organization of politics against the Jews. That's how I would define it. That's very narrow, but I think much more precise about the phenomenon that I am talking about. So how does it begin? Well, it begins somewhere in the 19th century. That's where the ideas for modern anti-Semitism begins. And it begins very specifically. The term is formed, and the book that promotes it is by Wilhelm Marr, M-A-R-R, whose dates are 1819 to 1904. And he actually founded the League of Anti-Semites. And the book that he wrote was a book that was called The Triumph of Judentum, of Jewishness, or not of Judaism, but of Judentum, of the Jewish people, as it were, over Germanentum. So his book is translated as The Triumph of Judaism or of Jewishness over Germanness. Now, he was a man of the left. It's very interesting to get this right. He was a man of the left who participated in the revolutionary movements of 1848. He was disillusioned afterwards, and then he became a fiery German nationalist at the time of German reunification. And it's in that context that he writes about this book. What does he mean by this? And this is really very profound, because what he's looking at is emancipation. And it's the same thing that the French looked at in 1789, when the Count de Clermont-Tonnerre stood up at the French Assembly. He said very much he was worried about the same things. People who looked at their nation forming and wanted to emancipate everybody, wanted to call everybody a citizen, and that everybody would now be competitive and free to compete in the citizenry. This was a problem. What were you going to do with the Jews? Now, you see, it was a real problem for them, because the Jews were going to be a competitive element that you didn't entirely understand, but what you did understand is that they are not assimilable. That the phenomenon of the Jews in history is that they are not assimilable. And that's the bone that sticks in the throat, in the craw. For the Jews, it is not a problem. That is to say, Jews are constituted as a minority. The most misunderstood thing is that you are a chosen. What does it mean to be chosen? Well, to be chosen means you are chosen to be self-reliant and to hold yourself to a certain standard, which is God-ordained, and you better live up to it, but you can live up to it wherever you are. And mostly you live up to it because you were promised the land of Israel if you do it right. And if you don't do it right, the land will be taken away from you, but you'll get it back as soon as you do it right. So that's a very, very, and so to treat this subject well, I would have to spend half my time talking about how the Jews are constituted politically, right? Because the way in which they're constituted politically becomes one of the ways in which anti-Semitism works against them. I don't have time for that. But I did write this book, Jews in Power, the first part of which is about how the Jews are constituted politically. And the second part is about how anti-Semitism is against them. But I have to leave out the first part. But you can see that from the point of view of a Frenchman, or the point of view of Wilhelm Marr, he's worried about this unassimilable entity. And he's more worried than the French because what he sees in Germany is a real threat. He says the Jews are taking over, basically. Look at Rothschild. Look at the people, who are entering our universities and becoming our lawyers. Look at the field of music. Look at the field of journalism. Look at all these. Look at the Jews. By the time, at the end of the 19th century, Vienna, you could look at Vienna and you saw all the Jews in this phenomenon. It's overwhelming. They are taking over Germandom. And so why I find this so remarkably insightful is that this is the first time, if you take democracy seriously, as opposed to autocracy in any form, autocracy commands from above. Democracy, even when when you have to win over the electorate, it's very different. You have to appeal to the electorate in some way. We need hardly be told that. How am I going to win you over to my ideas that are against emancipation, in a way, that want to alert you to the dangers of liberal democracy? I don't like it. What I want is some kind of the old order or some way of saying Germany for the Germans. How am I going to win you over? Am I going to talk to you against freedom? And am I going to talk to you against liberty? Am I going to talk to you against equality? Are these arguments I can make? I'm against equality? Very difficult. But if you say, this is not really equality, this is a Jewish plot to take over Germany, and then it becomes the protocols of the elders of Zion, which does that for all of Europe. No, the Jews are not there only to take over Germany. They're there to take over the world. So that, to my mind, what he does brilliantly, and then what other politicians begin to do in greater and greater numbers, is to define liberal democracy, to define all these aspects of modernity, to define all these aspects of creative competition as the Jewish plot. And it's very easy to make that argument. So if you look at it functionally, just some of the ones that I would say, what are the advantages of anti-Semitism to the politician who uses it? So first of all, it discredits the apparent value of equal rights and opportunity by framing them as anti-German or anti-national sabotage. So the threat of the Jews reinforces the need for national unity, right? And parenthetically, when people object to Trump's use of the term America First, they are trying to bring back the way in which America First was used in the 1930s as that kind of nationalism. In other words, a reactive against a particular people. But this is really, again, so second point. So Marr's modern secular movement appealed no less to traditionalists and churchmen from whom he claimed independence. So anti-Jewish politics creates an anti-liberal coalition, spans left and right, religious and secular, traditionalists and moderns. And the interesting thing is, why did he call it anti-Semitism? He makes a lot of that point. He doesn't want it to be called Judeophobia or anything like that. He does not want to collapse it with the Christian hatred of Jews or antagonism to Jews that preceded it. You see, he doesn't want you to think of it as a discursive swamp. He distinguished himself very carefully from anti-Jewish bias of a religious nature that came before. No. His is strictly a political tool that he is trying to define. That's why he uses a modern term, anti-Semitism, which he uses very precisely in this way: the Jews as a polity, as a force, which is a political threat. So these are some of the ways. So the coalition element is, I think, one of the most powerful reasons why anti-Semitism succeeds. It is the best coalition former that I know of. And look at the campus today. Just look at who is in this movement. It's a coalition. And there's nothing else that they could coalesce around. It is remarkable in that way, because you see he did draw in religious groups into his League for Anti-Semitism, and he did draw in conservatives, but he also drew in others who were the very opposite, right? Because of that. So that's yet another function. And then Jewish subversion offered a very simple explanation for complex hardships of modernization, urbanization, socioeconomic problems of a country in flux. So yes, they could say, you know why you're poor? It's because the Rothschilds have your money. You know why you're unemployed? It's because the Jews have your jobs. You know why your business is failing? It's because look at the Jewish, they're running all the department stores. They're the ones who are making all the money. So it's a very simple answer. And that's why you couldn't say the Gypsies. You see, the Gypsies won't work. I can't tell you that you're not feeling your Germanness because the Gypsies are going to take you over. It's ridiculous. I mean, that's not the kind of threat. If they pose a threat, it's a different kind of thing entirely. And I couldn't tell you that about the African Americans either. The worry about that kind of worry is something completely different. They're dragging us down. They are going to be thieves in our midst, whatever it's going to be. It's totally different. But about the Jews, you could say, just look, you could put a face on the danger. So there's that. And then this one aspect about the Jews, it's an apparently successful minority with no independent means of self-protection, and a small people with a hugely inflated and largely negative image. So you can attack the Jews with absolutely no fear of reprisal. Now, today you would say, no, Ruth, today you're wrong, because look at Israel. You know that Israel will now attack you if you attack Israel. We could get into that. It would take us too far away. I think just the opposite. If you look at the series that is now one of the most popular series on Netflix, Souda, which is about, it's really a terrific series. It is about the Israelis who are the, most dangerous unit in the Israeli forces. They are the unit that pretend to be Palestinians and infiltrate Palestinian anti-Israel groups. So it's a series, a TV series based on that. And at one point, the hero of this series, in one of the most chilling and makes worth the price of admission, says, they're at a standoff because the Palestinian groups have captured one of their people and have cut out a kidney of his with a knife. And he is on the phone with his colleagues now because the whole thing has been exposed. So he's on the phone with them saying, save me, you've got to save me. This is what they've done to me. But the Israeli side, this unit, has a sheikh. And so they say, you do anything to him and we're going to kill him. But they don't care. It's a different concept of what's expendable and what isn't. They don't care. So this guy, who is not like the Israelis you know, but he's like one of these people, he gets on the phone and he says, we will not only kill the sheikh, but I will come after you and I will personally kill every member of your family and I will drink their blood. You see, the Israelis didn't want this on television. But you see how counterintuitive. This is what Jews never did. It was a people that could only live through accommodation, and still does. It's a compulsive, self-defined minority. So that makes it the no-fail enemy, the no-fail target, and especially in the period we're talking about. You can see why Hitler had no problem. Because, the Jews were not constituted. They fought, by the way. Derek Penslar, who is now teaching in the history department here, has written a phenomenally interesting book about Jews in the military in the period we're talking about. But what it's about is the Jews in every other military. They were in the military of all these nations to prove what good citizens they were. They went into the French army like Dreyfus. They went into the German army. They went into the Russian army. They fought and bravely. So they were in all the militaries, but there was no Jewish military. So that's why anti-Semitism works. So I could go on, and it's in the paper and so this. But what I'm trying to point to here is the functions of anti-Semitism. If you look at the functions of anti-Semitism, you don't wonder why it succeeds. You just wonder, how come not everybody's using it? How come it's limited in any way? Because its functions are so very great. So that's how it starts. But then the other parts of the paper that I would just briefly allude to. So it's not a right-wing movement at all. Yes, it was a right-wing movement when it was used by Nazism, but it was also very much a left-wing movement, and its language actually begins with Karl Marx. He put the Jewish face on capitalism. And so, if you read Marx at the beginning, he has his paper on the Jewish question, and what he says is that the God of the Jews is money. And he actually defines the Jews as capitalists, which is true in a sense. They are these functional middlemen or whatever it is that capitalism becomes. That is the way they function. That's how they make themselves useful. And if you don't like that function, then you don't think they're useful, which is Hannah Arendt's point in her study of totalitarianism, which finds the common thread between totalitarianism of the left and totalitarianism of the right to be anti-Semitism. So if you look at it in the left wing, that's again, you see the coalition forming. How many movements in modern politics can say that they can combine left and right? Is there another? But this is a coalition that can work, uniting left and right. But in the Soviet Union, that's where anti-Zionism is formed. So precisely, anti-Zionism is the left-wing form of anti-Semitism. And what communism was against were two parts of Judaism. One, communism is, of course, against religion. But even more, it's an internationalist movement, which is against nationalism. Well, once the Soviet Union was formed, they realized that they had to work with the existing, 60-some-odd nationalities in the Soviet Union. So they knew that they had to work through all these nationalities. But all those nationalities were landed, right? They were concentrated in certain areas, the Georgians, the Armenians, and so forth. But the Jews were all over the place. And the Jews did not yet have a land. So Zionism became, for Soviets, including the Jews among them, may I say. Enemy number one. And the anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union began contemporaneously with the founding of the Soviet Union. They expelled Hebrew. Learning Hebrew, speaking Hebrew was a crime. Hebrew because it was both the language of religion, but particularly because that was the time when the Zionist movement was actually really beginning to rev up. And so all the slogans that you find in in the current anti-Zionism, they were all formed in the Soviet Union, particularly in the 1930s. And just the point where this becomes most painful and most precise is in 1929 were the biggest, until that time, the first really major pogroms in Palestine itself, where the Mufti of Jerusalem, already the beginnings of the Muslim Brotherhood at that time, really fomented violence against the Jews of the yeshuv of the Jewish community of Palestine. And they slaughtered all these yeshiva boys, mass slaughters in Palestine, and the British did nothing to actually protect the Jews. Stalin saw his moment of opportunity, and he defined that as the beginnings of the Arab Revolution. So for him, these were positive developments. Yes, it's too bad that they take the form of anti-Jewish riots, but that's the beginning of the Arab communist revolution. And throughout the 30s, this was really the idea of anti-Zionism. And Mahmoud Abbas, you know that he wrote his PhD in Moscow on the fact that Zionism collaborated with Nazism during the Second World War. So Mahmoud Abbas's actual education was at the University of Lumumba University in Moscow, right? On Soviet-formed anti-Zionism. So that is the anti-Zionist form. And when we come to our day, then the Arab League founded in 1945, same year as the United Nations. Because of the United Nations, perhaps, because the Arabs came out of World War II very much ahead of the game, because the imperial countries were pretty much exhausted by the war, I think. And the Arab countries were just beginning to come into their own. So you look at the formation of the Arab League. The Arab League, you can see that the Arabs are not all in harmony with one another. So what was going to be the glue that held the Arab League together? What? Countries like Syria and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, right? Transjordan, Yemen, right? What was it? Perfect. They could unite against the creation of a Jewish state. So 1945 was 3 years before the creation of Israel and 2 years before the UN resolution. The Arabs needed this. And it's, as it was said very often, that if God did not exist, one would have to invent him. If the Jews did not exist, this is Sartre's point in his book on anti-Semite and Jew. If the Jews did not exist, the anti-Semites would have to invent him. Well, it is certainly true from the Arab point of view that if Israel did not exist, or proto-Israel did not exist, the Arabs would have had to invent it. And they didn't have to invent it. And the Arab war against Israel and the Jewish people's right to a state has been the glue of that world, in so much as there is any glue of that world, ever since. And even though happily, where we speak now, there are some countries that are ready to kind of give it up, but not so fast. They still do not completely say that they will accept coexistence with the State of Israel. And what does it serve there? The purpose is it is against coexistence. It's against the principle of coexistence. Yes, it's against the West and what Israel represents as a liberal democracy, but it's basically against the principle of coexistence itself. So again, the function of this is so important that when you look at it from that point of view, I wouldn't say, I don't think this is despairing at all. I mean, if I were in despair, I would never give myself over to this. No, I think that this is a problem that can be tackled. And I think that these are points that can be made, and this is something that can be illuminated and that it can be fought. But you have to see how powerful the function of this is. And particularly since the Arabs, and I won't go into that because I do want to really very interested in your thinking about this, but you have to see how far ahead anti-Zionism now / anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, you have to see how much farther it has advanced over Hitlerism. You see, I'd get up in faculty and people would say, but you know, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. How dare you conflate these two? No, it's not. You know what? It's 10 times worse. Because it comes after, for one thing, so it has taken into itself all the component features of anti-Semitism. But it is so much worse because of the greater function that it serves in the Arab Muslim worlds, because of the greater function that it plays internationally, because of the ease of getting the word out. And one of the things I point to here is when you look at how poor Hitler had to work to orchestrate the Nuremberg masses. You know, you had to build these things. You had to have these marching armies. You had to, do things on this scale. You had to have an architect build these things. You had to have the filmmaker who would film the films and all this. Hey, today, one imam every Friday on television, every household in the Arab world gets the message. One TV series pumped into this throughout Ramadan shows you how Jews kill Christian and Muslim children for the baking of matzahs on Passover, right? And how they, that's where that thing of drinking your blood comes from. He was playing on that, right? You think we don't drink your blood? Oh, damn well, I'll get back. That's the only thing you're afraid of in that desperate scene of theirs. So this is really what we, I think, face, and just why one would talk about this. And here you come to a campus like this. Why no one will deal with this? Well, if you believe in conflict resolution, you do not want to hear me say this. You do not want to think this, because there is no conflict resolution in a unilateral war. I don't use the term the Arab-Israel conflict, and certainly not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There is no such thing. There's the Arab war against Israel and the right of the Jewish people to a country. It's an Arab war against. There is no conflict of that kind. It's a unilateral war, and I have really gone against my own law, because I say you never treat this subject without a full-scale map of the Middle East. Never a map of Israel, a full-scale map of the Middle East. You could not look at a map of the Middle East and believe that the Palestinian-Israeli sort of whatever it is matters an iota. It is such a stupid concept of anyone who has any brains. Just have to look at that map. It's not just that it's asymmetrical, it's preposterous, right? So anyone who likes conflict resolution, you can see how much of a push there is. Let's get a group of Muslims together and let's get a group of Jews together. Oh, let's get this group and that together, and we will have a peace rally, and we will have a peace process, and we will have a peace this, and we will have a peace that. It is self-delusion of a monstrous kind, I think. And everybody wants to keep it going because they want to believe in conflict resolution. There's a deep, deep need in us to be what they call optimists in this sense. You want to believe that these are things which can be dealt with through rational argument, through give and take. But when you see blessings on this country, when you see how hard give and take is, even within the American polity, which is the best that we've got in the whole wide world, right? When you see how hard it is, can you imagine conflict resolution under these circumstances when they need that antagonist so desperately? They need to organize against. And so, in a way, the Jews have no choice. If you take this seriously as a Jew, in a way, you have no choice but to deal with it. But Jews should not be dealing with the subject of anti-Semitism. It is not a Jewish problem. There is no Jewish question. There is no Jewish problem. The problem is the problem of the anti-Jews. The problem is the problem of anti-Semitism. They are the problem. And so what one tries to do in this kind of study is very simple in a way, but very complicated. Anti-Semitism works through a policy of deflected attention. It points the finger at the Jews. And all you have to do to fall into that trap is to follow the pointing finger. The minute you begin to talk about the Jews or about Israel, its nature, its size, anything about it, they've won, hands down. They have made it the subject. And the point is that if you stand in the defendant's box, you are the defendant. It doesn't matter who your defense attorney is. It doesn't matter how great a thing. You are the defendant. They are the prosecution. And the point here is you never, never stand in the defendant's box in this argument. You have to prosecute. You have to turn the attention on them. Why cannot they accept the principle of coexistence? How far behind will they always remain in what we think of as important to the progress of civilization if they cannot accept the principle of coexistence? Why do they do this? Why do they have to foment violence? Why? They are the problem. So you can see how successful all of this has been, that as far as I'm concerned, what embarrasses me is that all of this is so rudimentary to me that it embarrasses me, as if you're saying, I'm a great mathematician, therefore I will show you that 1 + 1 = 2, when that's all I know. So to me it's an embarrassment because it is so clear and obvious. But the job of this disinformation and of pointing the finger and of inversion has been lasted for so long, and it has such power, and it has obviously such appeal, and it is so hard for people to stand against it, that the obvious is the most obvious things become invisible. They're not obvious at all. And that, and so I come back to that. I think that the people who can set it right in terms of thinking, ideationally, are really people who deal with matters of governance and international politics and political theory and so forth. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth. Yes, question.
Thank you so much for coming. I have to say, as an Asian and a conservative, a lot of what you said in terms of we're coming for our jobs and our economy, all of our things are being manufactured there, could very much apply to the fastest growing group of immigrants in America, the Chinese, right? And so I feel that very strongly. But on the issue of, say, Asian Americans, I think that So Robert George accuses me of being a little bit too Hegelian and optimistic about some of these problems, but our UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, has consistently called this out from minute one, that like 80% of their UN resolutions are against Israel.
Right.
And I guess my question for you is, looking since the Trump administration has come, it seems to me that there is finally a group of people who are standing up and at least calling a spade, right? And I think, do you feel that this is a positive development? And I would also say that it seems as though events have swamped this narrative. I mean, having been all over the Middle East, you do look at the map and it's like, this is a joke, man. Gaza's like 2 miles wide, and you're telling me that ISIS is just going to sit down, hold hands with all the other actors, sing Kumbaya, and end all problems in the Middle East. That Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to end their proxy war in Yemen just because Israel and Palestine talk to each other. I mean, it's just laughable on its face, right? And it seems to me that the world is kind of accepting more of this view, I think, in public opinion, that the Palestinians just don't matter. And the way that I would say that happening is that it seems as though Israel is now continuing to do basically whatever they want, and it's now out of the limelight. So I wonder if you would say that in the last couple of years, due to, for instance, the failure of the West to support the Arab Spring, where it now descends into a whole bunch of failed states, plus the election of Donald Trump, is actually a positive thing for the Jewish state.
Yes, well, I couldn't say it better. So I thank you really for that. Yeah, I agree completely. But the 8 years of the Obama administration have worked in the other direction. And they've also mobilized an entire group. And so it depends where you look. I would say that Nikki Haley at the United Nations is the first hopeful sign in a very long time. And that she has been saying the right things at the Human Rights Council.
Which Syria was supposed to be head of a few years ago before they dropped barrel bombs and chemical weapons on their own people in the name of human rights, right?
Well, but you see, this brings me back to the question of how clever it was to form that coalition. That in forming that coalition against Israel, what the Arabs were able to do is to turn the entire United Nations to unify huge parts of the United Nations. So instead of being on the defensive, they are now on the offensive. They don't have to defend their country's human rights things. All these countries that you look at it and you say, this is absurd. Cuba and Syria, running the Human Rights Commission. What is that? It's a joke. It isn't a joke. It is deflection of attention. So because they were able to form that coalition against Israel, and if they can keep Israel, you see, they have to keep doing that, because otherwise they are the subject of human rights attention, right? So the more they keep attention focused on Israel, you may say it's absurd, but tactically it is brilliant. And on the campus, let me say again, how many rallies have you seen for Syrian refugees? How many women's groups are upset about the treatment of women and honor killings? There's a movie about honor killings. It won't even be shown on campuses at all. What a gift it is to all these people to have a boycott, divestment movement against Israel. And I'm always at odds with my colleagues, because my colleagues really go to bat for this. They are the best of people. The best are the ones who fight against this, right? Who fight against the BDS movement. But from my perspective, as a political strategist, if you will, what difference does that make? If I'm fighting BDS, I go to the MLA convention. They have gotten their troops to pass this resolution of BDS at the MLA.
Do they even have money to invest?
What's that?
Do they actually have money to invest?
Well, no. There's big money at stake, but but the MLA, the historian.
We need to define MLA,
the Modern Languages Association, the Historical Association, the Anthropology Association. These are all academic associations that have spent an enormous amount of time and effort to put forth resolutions to the entire membership on the question of boycotting Israel. Now, you have to ask yourself, what is the American Historical Association doing with this kind of resolution? Think of the function. Think of what it is detracting attention from. Think of the power of the coalition that is being formed on the left, because of this. Think of the groups that form around this. Think of the energy. There are reasons for it. So what I'm saying is that for my colleagues, my best of my colleagues, to write these petitions against and to mobilize, to go to the Modern Languages Association and to say, no, we're going to fight this resolution and so on, you're just playing into their hands from my perspective. But because it's still the subject, you see. You still have not managed to make them the subject. The real, there is real damage being done in the world. If you take that seriously, if you care at all about the real horrors in the world, you understand that this distraction is really bad. It's not whether Israel will be able to defend itself or not. Of course, I am committed to that. That's because I'm committed to it. But if I care, if anything in me cares about those poor Palestinians or poor anybody, this is being used creatively as a distraction, never to solve those problems, never to address those problems. So this is what differentiates the Chinese case from the anti-Semitism case. So on all other grounds you are right, but this particular kind of function, you see, is unique to anti-Semitism as that kind of ism. So distinctions are worth keeping in mind too. But
and that's going to change over time.
Yes, hopefully, yes, it can, and for the worse too sometimes. Yes, it does. Yeah, sure.
To what extent do you think Israel and Jews are proxies for America and capitalism? And these people are critical of those two things, but
Yes.
it's easier to attack
Yes.
the
Yes.
microcosm of
Yes, yes, definitely. Because these same people are anti-American. I mean, it is, it doesn't take too much to show that the anti-Israel movement, anti-Jewish movement is always the same as anti-Americanism. But if you're choosing your enemy, and you choose between these two, I would say that choosing the Jews is a safer bet. First of all, you've got more negative energy already built in. You hardly have to make the case. There's this horrible joke that emerged, and that's why the book is called No Joke. There's this horrible joke, but I love it, that emerged after World War I. Somebody comes and says, the sheriff of the town comes to his assistant and says, round up all the Jews and all the bicyclists. And the assistant says, why the bicyclists? See, it takes a while to even understand. Is that a joke? Do you see the joke? It doesn't. The fact that you would round up all the Jews is not even questioned. The question is why the bicyclists. So, and so anybody who says what's the joke, you see, this is one of those wonderful jokes where the joke is on you for not getting the joke and so forth. And so, that, I have to tell you that writing that book on No Joke, one of my favorite reviewers, on Amazon, the devastating thing of Amazon, the reviewers on Amazon. So one says, really, no joke. He says, I'll tell you what the function of this book is. You put it in your medicine cabinet in case your sleeping pills fail.
Well, that's a function.
Devastating. This is to tell you that it's not very funny and so forth. Yeah. So there is just sorry.
Yeah.
That was yeah.
Sure. I'm especially interested in anti-Semitism on the left, which poses a problem for me, particularly since so many American Jews, at least, have themselves been partisans of the left. It's sort of a paradox. And so then what is the argument that underlay the hatred of Israel? Is it that Israel is a successful state? The Palestinians have not been politically successful? Is it that the Palestinians view, or Israel and the leftists in general view Israel as an outpost of in the imperialism of the West? I mean, even Jews I know are anti-Israel.
Yeah.
This is this
Especially Jews,
This
you
is
might say.
interesting to me. How did it happen that the left? Yeah, I suppose it all. And is it the same thing, being anti-Semitic and being anti-Israel? The anti-Israel prejudice, or whatever you'd want to call it, is astonishing to me in its intensity and authority. I don't understand it. That's one reason I'm here today.
Well, the question of anti-Semitism on the left and its intensity and all that is a huge subject. And so I can't answer the question adequately, but it's the biggest question.
Yeah.
Because that's where the animus is coming from these days.
Yeah.
Yes, there are people there's an alt-right out there, and they will catch on to this and they will use it, but it is totally a distraction. But you can see that many of the Jews are delighted with this in the same way that they were delighted with McCarthy. You have to think, if you think about McCarthyism, it might begin to be an indirect way of getting at your question. So maybe this is too convoluted, but I'll try it out. So McCarthy was the biggest gift to the left in this country, to the hard left. Huge gift. Because the left, when McCarthyism arose, there was a lot that the left had to answer for in this country.
Yeah.
Especially, may I say, and this is the delicate part of my enterprise. There is so much proclivity to blame the Jews that one does not want to go into that and hold the Jews responsible for what they actually are responsible for, because of course they were held responsible for communism when they were not responsible for communism. But if I say something to you, it will reflect badly on them, so I hesitate to do that. However, the first newspaper that the Soviet Union created in the United States as its weapon, internationalism, to defy the United States from within, was the Yiddish newspaper, the Freiheit, in New York. If you look at the membership of the Communist Party in this country, the Jewish percentage of it was huge, for very understandable reasons in some ways, because of their background in the Soviet Union, because they were against Tsarism, because they saw this as their against Nazism that was rising from the beginnings of the 20th century. So there were all good reasons for it. But the hard left in this country had a huge Jewish representation.
Right.
And they went into Hollywood. Right. And they went into the professions of, as much as possible, of ideas and ideas dissemination. So where did those people go? Do you think they didn't have children? You think they didn't have grandchildren? You don't know many of these people as being red diaper babies or whatever they're called, but I grew up in Montreal among them. I can tell you.
Well, I've known a few, yes.
And to the third and fourth generation, these kids, their religion is leftism. Yes, they're Jews because they're not expelled, and you don't have to convert to leftism. That's the great difference. In the 19th century, I'm not kidding, there were tens of thousands of Jews who converted to Christianity. And Hitler did not get them all. Most of them remained Christians. And through the history of the world, you can imagine how many Jews there would be if this was not a perennial situation. Many Jews can't stand the heat, don't want it, don't want to remain Jews, so they convert. Our problem here in America is conversion is not necessary. So Jews do not convert. They become something else. They really become completely given over to another set of ideals. And they call it Judaism, or they don't detach themselves from it. So the hard left is out there. And it used McCarthyism in its time so creatively. If you look at the movies about Trumbo, all these writers who were persecuted, all these teachers who were persecuted. You could think that the United States has a record of persecuting the left, such as, that matches that of Stalin persecuting his enemies. That was their way of never coming to terms with having been Stalinists. What responsibility did they bear for what they supported? They never faced it. And what I see Trumpism doing today is the same thing to those leftists and to the liberals who don't want to look at the damage that Obama did to the cause of Israel. That really, really hard damage, not just by the first people he went to were the Iranians, right? I mean, he sought them out. And this is the only person that I can even think of who was formed by 3 or 4 concurrent strands of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's to his credit in a way that he isn't more of an anti-Semite, but real anti-Semitism. This is not to say, right, he was formed by Muslim anti-Semitism. He sat for 20 years in the Church of Jeremiah, right, which was an overtly anti-Semitic form of Christianity. Then in Chicago, he was on the hard left with people who are anti-Zionists in this way, in the way Noam Chomsky is, and the way the people are. I mean, they really think that Israel represents a retrogression because Jews didn't have a country and then they went for a country. What kind of movement was that in a time when you were supposed to denationalize yourself? Well, so there's all those elements go into it, and so, I mean, I'm a little bit off track, but again, just parenthetically, how curious we are at this point in time when for the first time, you see, why I don't take anti-Semitism as being inevitable. Why you have to look at it, what function it plays or doesn't play. Don't think it is inevitable, because today you have a very curious situation where there is more anti-Semitism being fomented in this country than in Russia. Why? Because Vladimir Putin, whatever else he may be, is not an anti-Semite. He happens to be, curiously enough, a philo-Semite. How did that happen? So curious. So I'm not coming to the defense of Putin. May I make it clear here? I am not. And one of the reasons that it's hard to write about this is it's very hard to write about this without seeming to come to the defense of Putin or something. All I am pointing out is that for some reason, for many reasons, he is not using this as an instrument of either foreign politics or internal domestic politics. You see that? He's not using it in Russia to say the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And he's certainly not using it internationally because the 1 million Russian Jews who went to Israel, he sees as a tremendous advantage. They speak Russian, so he goes to Israel very often. There's a very good relations at this moment between Israel and Russia. So it's not an inevitability, it's what function does it serve? And the Jewish liberals, which is more the people you're talking about than the hard left, that's their religion. That's what I wrote about in the liberal betrayal of the Jews. There are Jews who are religiously liberal. And it's in Christianity as well. You know that. Christianity, and certainly Catholicism, faces a very similar problem from within. There are Catholics who define Catholicism as liberalism. And when there's a choice to be made between the Catholic teaching and liberal teaching, they will choose liberalism every time. But no one is trying to destroy their polity. The only difference here is that someone is trying to destroy the Jewish polity. And so these liberals would have to come to the defense of this Jewish polity, really? Uphold Jewish nationalism? Uphold Jewish religious nationalism, whatever the Jews represent? God forbid. So they're very eager to hold Israel responsible for the aggression against it. That's what they do. They hold Israel responsible, and is psychologically a break for them, because if I can hold Israel responsible for the aggression against it, then all I have to do is to put pressure on Israel. All I have to do is to get my president to put pressure on Israel. That will solve the problem, rather than putting pressure on those who are against it. So that's so much easier for people who want to think that. So there are many compelling reasons, I would say, for those people to keep slipping and slipping and slipping in that direction. And Trump is really somebody who's put a halt to it, but you can see how ferocious. It's not just the disappointment that others have had, but on the Jewish liberal street, the pathological reaction to Trump is something that goes beyond the rest of America. In New York, you can see that probably much more than here in Boston. But in New York, it's extraordinary. You know, synagogues would have an early morning service in order that they could participate in the parade that took place on the Sabbath.
March?
Yes, on the Women's March, exactly. And to march as Jews against Trump. I mean, this is really extraordinary. So they have chosen sides. And these are people who go to the synagogue, you understand. These are not your hard leftists that I'm talking about. These are already ideological liberals who really feel that that's their religion. And so it's a real, Martha, it's a real question. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Well, if Obama is anti-Zionist, the 38.8 billion over the next 10 years was shooting himself in the foot. But when I heard you describe the various kinds of prejudice that Wilhelm Marr described, what came to my mind immediately was the numerous groups within this country that Trump has demonized in the campaign, and now in his anti-immigrant and anti-refugee policies that the liberal Jews you describe are screaming against. I am also, I've been hoping all week that you would help me to understand the bizarre relationship of Donald Trump to anti-Semitism. I take it you don't agree with the Southern Poverty Law Center's belief that the huge surge in anti-Semitic bomb threats in the last few months can be largely blamed on Mr. Trump.
Well, this is a bad day to ask the question because, of course, they have found the perpetrator of those bomb threats. He happens to be an Israeli. So that, and I must say, I understand your point. And of course, I might say that in terms of the press and the media, yours may be the majority opinion. But it is the majority opinion of people.
Is it among Jews the majority opinion?
Well, to the extent that 75% or over 70% of Jews have voted for Obama and Obamaism, those people clearly identify with that. And as I was saying, they are extremely exercised. Look, it is no fun for a Jew who does not want to fight. Look around you on this campus. You know how many Jewish professors there are? A lot. They're not the majority, but there are a lot. How many of them want to be seen as standing up for Israel against the Arab attack on it, against BDS attack on it, against the boycott movement, against anything that got it? No, because they are nice people. And I respect that. They are not fighters. That's why they went into the academy. They thought it would protect them from this kind of thing. They thought that they would remain neutral above it all. Now comes a war against the Jews again? My God, I don't want this. And yet, they're in a conundrum because it's not nice not to defend your people in a way. So that's why many of them find this very creative outlet to join things like J Street. Whole movements have formed now in the United States which are against the state of Israel, essentially. But they
You
say,
believe J Street is against the state of Israel?
yes, of course, functionally. Yes, I do. I mean, I could show you how they are. Because when the
What is J Street?
Oh, well, J Street, thank you. Yes, I know this. We have an audience that. Well, J Street is something to look up. It is the latest iteration of a left-wing movement that says that Israel really has to prove its legitimacy. And it certainly has to prove its legitimacy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It does not believe, in my analysis, that there is an Arab war against Israel. It does not believe, in my analysis, that I didn't even go into here, of how the Palestinian problem was created. So let's go back to that. The Arab world could not do without the Palestinian problem. So Israel took in almost 1 million refugees from Arab lands, which are now completely free of Jews, places where Jews lived for over 2,000 years. Yemen, Iraq, Iran, no Jews. No Jews. Where did those Jews go? They went to Israel. What did Israel do? It absorbed them. Now, there are many people who say, you call that absorption? That's not absorption. How many Ethiopian Jews are there on the Supreme Court? What's the equality feature? In other words, they're already at the point of using the same kind of information, saying, oh, yeah, absorption, very nice, but is there equality? Is there that? So in other words, you keep the pressure on Israel to prove itself, which is fine for Jews to do. However, what the Arab world did is it refused the partition of Palestine. It refused the Palestinians their state. It's not the Jews who refused the Palestinians their state. It is the Arab world, and they kept the Palestinians as refugees. It is the smallest refugee population in the 20th century. Get that. Look at the Korean War. Look at the war in India. Look at the war in India, right over Bangladesh. There are 1 million refugees at that point, and millions of refugees. I'm a refugee. I came from Europe in 1940. I never knew anyone who was not a refugee. May I say that? I mean, I grew up only among refugees. You say refugee to me, I don't blink. What does it mean, refugee? If you found refuge somewhere and nobody's killing you, you kiss the ground, whatever it is, right? And you say, thank you. No, but the Arabs kept the Palestinians in the greatest act of cruelty ever committed.
To their fellow Arabs. To their fellow Arabs.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with you
So
on
now
many
what,
historical points, but I think you're dodging the question.
I am not, because now this is the answer to the question. The so-called occupation of the territories was the consequence of the Arab war against Israel. The consequence. It cannot retroactively have become its cause. Now, what J Street wants to do is to say that the cause of the conflict is the Jewish occupation of disputed territories of the West Bank. So, you are still at the point. I would really invite you, if you possibly could, just to go and start off in Jerusalem and take a trip that would take you no more than 4 hours to go all the way to the northernmost point or to the farthest point of the so-called territories and back, and to see what one is talking about. So J Street devotes its whole energy to fighting its fellow Jews on the subject of Israel instead of fighting the Arab war against the Jews. It has made that decision. That's why it is anti-Israel. It is, because if I join the side of, and I say I'm doing it for the sake of the Jewish people, because I want them to be spotless I don't want them to be responsible for the Palestinians. So I want them to solve the problem of the Palestinians. It's been crazy. I mean, Israel tried to give back Gaza because it wanted to It left them these hothouses. It left them a flourishing place, which they destroyed. They destroyed everything that Israel left them. They are polluting their own water supply rather than helping their own citizens. It is a kind of, look, I can't even say that, what can I tell you? People put that kind of nationalism higher than what we call aspects of humanity. That is they believe land is ultimate. What can I say? That's their belief. I cannot change that. All I can do is to fight against it. I can say it may be your belief. You are entitled to, let me just give you some figures, maybe. Okay. Arab countries cover 5,148,000 square miles. Do you know that the United States is only 3.8 million square miles? So
0.2% figure in your 15-page article for today.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that for a Jewish group to say that the problem is those extra square miles, and until you solve that problem, I'm against you, and I want my President of the United States of America to make that his priority rather than going to the UN and fighting that. That's a decision on their part. And it is a profoundly anti-Jew. And it's...
Do the Palestinians have any right to the land of their forefathers?
I don't know. They certainly don't. They're looking... There's no Palestinian on record who has said that they want what you think is their... They want Israel. That's what they want, and they say it quite clearly. You cannot... The one thing that you should not do is to change their language for them. That's disrespectful.
I wouldn't.
No, I meant J Street too.
Oh, you mean...
That's disrespectful. In other words, you have to take, not because they're your enemy, you have to take people at their word. If they tell you that their belief is that they're entitled to the whole land of Israel, you have no right to make them up in your image. You must face the fact that they think the entire land of Israel belongs to them, that the Middle East is hegemonic, and it all belongs to the Arab and Muslim world, as they will divide it among themselves. They believe that. Now, the Saudis, at the present moment, seem no longer to believe that. By the way, the king of Transjordan, who was assassinated because of it, came to grips with the fact that he didn't believe. He wanted to make peace with Israel. This is the original Hashemite ruler in 1948. And Anwar Sadat, came to peace with him, and he was assassinated as a result. So I would just say that I try to be respectful in my way. I take them at their word, and they will not take this. You see, my point is
You're grouping them all together, and that's a mistake. And
I'm
that
not.
makes peace impossible.
No, I'm not. But I would say that the idea of my meeting personally, you see, this idea of groups getting together on this campus and doing this kumbaya, as you said, this is all very, well, but political, that's why it comes down to political culture matters. Political differences matter. You cannot pretend that all peoples are alike in their political outlook. Political culture goes very deep. That's all I am saying. And you have to understand that the Arab world has not really yet begun the process of emancipation, reformation, which took Europe so long and was so troubled. So once this process begins, it's not going to be over for, believe me, it's not just my lifetime. It's going to be
100 years.
More than 100 years. It's already been 70 years and there hasn't been a move really. So it's going to be hundreds of years.
We've got a couple more questions.
Sure, sorry, I've gone too long. Yeah.
I just to follow up on his question. I was under the impression that the Palestinians were kind of there now, were not necessarily the historical people, that was actually a pretty sparsely populated area, and a lot of the way that these Arabs came into that area was actually development by the Jewish settlers. They came in for jobs. They came in because of the development that was there. The British were supposed to keep them out, and while the British restricted immigration from Europe, the Jews coming in from Europe, even at a time of Nazism, they let a bunch of Arabs and today's Palestinians just stream in.
Yes.
And with the higher birth rate that they have, it becomes a whole situation. Why isn't that history, which has been documented, really put forth and,
Well, it is because you know it, so it is put forth by some. No, it is put forth by some historians, and there are books on the subject that prove it. But it is not an argument which can easily be won through this kind of evidence. You have to be ready to make those to hear those kind of arguments from the people who make them. And besides, a lot has changed in these years. It doesn't take that long for a nationalism of a certain kind to develop. If you see how Palestinian children are raised and what they are taught in their summer camps and what their school books say and how they are, what they are taught, you realize that this cannot be eradicated overnight. That was my point about the Jewish left. I know these people, they went to summer camps, they went to schools. There are 2 generations of American Jews, let alone the other side, right, who were raised to believe these things, that Israel, that Zionism was a retrogressive step. Now, these people, if they believe it, what do I expect of the Palestinian children who are being raised to think these things, you see? Unless the teaching changes. So there has to be a huge political cultural change for things, and you have to have the stamina to hold out and to do things. It's very important what the United States says and does in this, because it is looked to as the world leader. So what the president and what the Congress and what academics say and do is really important. Because you make the case. And when somebody starts saying the opposite to you, you say, excuse me, I know better. And you just turn around, you say, what about you? What preparations have you made for statehood? What infrastructure are you building? What concentration are you putting on your own people to do anything? Do you have any civic culture? All I hear about is, fighting against, but what about anything like that, you see? So I would say you always have to turn the tables. That's, yeah. Sure.
So I really liked your talk, but I'd like to gently question the framework thesis here, because I feel like there's a tension between how you opened and closed the talk. The beginning, we had a functional rationalist explanation of anti-Semitism. At the end, we had examples of anti-Semitism leading people into perverse and irrational acts. So the functional rational argument broke down when you're poisoning your own water supply, for example. So my question would be, the argument is being made, I find it somewhat convincing, that anti-Semitism it's protean, obviously, but it's a religious passion.
Yeah.
There's this, early Levinas essay that he later suppressed, where he says, the relationship between anti-Semitism and religion is the same as the relationship between pornography and love. So it's a degraded form of a. Then you spoke about the need for a reformation, long lasting. So if this is the case, if anti-Semitism is a type of religious passion, right? This would not be an argument against waging the kind of functionalist war that you're describing, but it would be an argument against stopping there or seeing the functional argument as the fundamental explanation of what's happening.
Well, what you're asking is very valuable, because thank you so much. By functional, I don't mean that that's the way it's created. In other words, I don't think that Wilhelm Marr thought of this as a strategist. And I don't think that what the Palestinian Authority does or what anybody else does is they think strategically and therefore they do this. I don't even think that the Arab League was founded and said to itself, we need an enemy, therefore let's unite around this common enemy. No, of course not. All I mean is that from the point of view of analyzing it, from the point of view of studying it, your point of view studying it has to look at, yes, their thinking and what it goes into it. We have to examine the functional aspects of it, in that it plays in their religious life, in their cultural life, in their political life, in their economic life, in every aspect of life. You see what I mean? So by using the word functional, I thank you for that. I don't mean that, yes, and of course there's a functional aspect to the Palestinian idea. They just think that destroying Israel is more important than anything than building their own infrastructure. They just really believe that. Why else would they teach their children to be? I mean, do you see what it takes to be a suicide bomber? A suicide bomber, by the way, it's not something you do on your own. This is a very complicated thing. Ball bearings, it takes a village to build a suicide bomber. You know, this is, really. So that they will give up their children and that they will give up their wives and that they will give up living human beings to this task, they obviously think that this task is religiously more important than building a polity of their own and proving themselves capable of coexistence, because this is what we're talking about. Are you capable of coexisting? Can you accept that?
So if it is religious, then how do you suppress religion?
One last question from
Okay.
Steve Rosen.
Oh, sure, please. I'm sorry. I will talk.
Well, I'm
Please.
learning much more from this discussion than I would be able to contribute. But on the logic of your argument, things are going to get worse. The ability, the way in which anti-Semitism can be used to generate international coalitions is going to and is driving Iran to deliberately take on Israel as an adversary, as the only weapon available to Iran to gain non-Shiite allies in the region. I mean, they are pushing Hezbollah and IRGC units to the Golan Heights. And they know what the Israelis will do, and they want the Israelis, I think. This is the slide inspired by you. To have the Israelis attack them would be a mitzvah, a blessing.
Yes, for them.
Because it would transform them into the forefront of the war against Israel.
Right.
So I don't know exactly what our response to that, but your talk made me think through a particular logic which fits with what we see, so there's a source for concern. Internally, the question is, how long do you think it will be before the anti-Islamic sentiment in the United States is attributed to Jews?
Long. On that question, I don't. It's a struggle. There are people who are working in that direction. It hasn't worked so far. But in your first point, I would say yes, that is true. But you have to understand now how many countries now want to ally themselves with Israel too strategically. Now that is not as deep, because what the country has to offer is really only technological and warfare, certain kinds of proficiency. That is why a lot depends on the United States. A lot. But I would say that the fate of the United States, personally, may I say, I worry more about the United States at this point than I do about Israel. For the first time in my life. Because Israel is under so much pressure, the polity there has grown in my lifetime much stronger, much more capable of accepting the reality of aggression against you, which is a factor. If you're going to be successful at anything and want freedom, you have to be able to take the thing that is directed against you. So in Israel, they have no choice. And so you can see how much energy and maturity has been developed. Unfortunately, what you were saying before about, I don't see that in the United States to the same degree. And Trump, for all that it's a reaction to the softness, does not yet convince me that it is a manifestation of strength, right? So That's the question now. Thank you.
We have to stop. This lady is a tiger, and thank you for bringing your passion to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.